All right. So we're starting in with debtor creditor relations, relationships, I should say. Um, and we'll start with the basics. The foundational chapter is chapter 19, and then we'll delve a bit deeper into secured transactions in chapter 20. All right. The relevant law here, most of it is UCC Article 9. So you remember chapters 13 and 14 were also based on the UCC Article 2. So we know what we're getting. We're getting uniform laws that states have by and large adopted. Now, I will say that there's a bit more variation at the state level in Article 9 than there is in Article 2. There are certain areas, namely the exemptions um, from seizure or attachment. They vary from state to state, so each state has kind of filled theirs in. Um, All right, so let's talk a little bit about the terms. Oh, actually, let me mention one other thing before I get going here, and that's so this is CPA exam content. These terms show up on the CPA exam. All right, so we need to know them. We need to be aware of them, um, and um, so yeah, there's that. All right, uh, creditor. All right, so creditors have lent money um, are offered a line of credit for repayment with the expectation of repayment. And there are two main types. The first being a secured creditor, which is we'll get knee deep in chapter 20. But all it is secured creditors have their loans are backed by security or collateral. All right, so of course collateral is property pledged by the debtor to ensure payment. In other words, if the debtor doesn't pay, the creditor can take possession of the collateral. Unsecured creditors, right, which means that money's lent or advanced without security, without collateral. Right, so any credit card, well, most credit cards actually fall into that category. Right. Um, Debtor. Well, if you have a creditor, the debtor is the borrower. All right. Um, Debtors repay, usually with interest. Creditors. All right. Default is what happens when payment does not occur per the terms of the underlying agreement. All right. You may hear me say contract. It is a contract. The chapter doesn't use that term much, but when the debtor fails to live up to their agreement, they're in default. All right, and that gives the creditor some rights. All right, so I referenced UCC Article 9. Let's talk about liens. All right, and the names really don't mean what, well, the first two really don't mean what it sounds like they would mean. Um, I don't want it to get too fixated on the names of the liens, because, for example, mechanic's lien sounds like a mechanic has worked on your car, you haven't paid for it, and but that's not what it is. Um, anyway, let's start generally. Liens, claims against property, simple as that. Um, to satisfy a debt. All right. So mechanics liens. Let's just lead with the example. So let's say um, I have a roofer come install a roof on my house, right? And I pay the deposit, but upon completion of the job, I do not pay the final amount owed. And let's say I owe $3,000 or so on my roof. All right. Well, um, the roofer can file for a mechanics lien, and this would be done in the um, at the county clerk in the state of Ohio, file a mechanics lien, and of course I would be notified that there's a lien on my property. Um, and generally it sits there, right? It's hard to foreclose with that type of lien, usually when the value is relatively small. So it sits there until such time as I decide to sell the house. So I would not be able to, and that's assuming I don't dispute the validity of the lien. You do have an opportunity to do that. But when I go to sell my house, um, the buyers are going to write a check to me for my house, or maybe the buyer's lender will write a check to me for my house, and the roofer gets paid at that point in time. So this could be, years later, right? Ideally, I would have settled up before I go to sell the house, but if the lien is still there and still valid, the roofer gets paid before I get to collect any proceeds from the sale of my house. So that's how a mechanics lien works, and typically they're associated with real property, right? So mechanic, you may think of an automobile, but automobiles are personal property, not real property. So generally, we wouldn't see a mechanics lien on a car, right? Mechanics liens are created under state law. All right, they're statutory, whereas artisan liens come from common law, or equity, basically fairness. All right, judge-made law, so to speak. And this is a possessory lien. All right, and this is where if you take your car to a mechanic and the mechanic works on your car, let's say he does $1,500 worth of work, and then you don't pay for the vehicle, you don't pay for the repairs, I should say. Well, the mechanic will have an artisan lien on that vehicle, right? And typically can hold that until you pay for the repairs. All right, and at some point, there exists a right to sell the personal property to cover their costs, to recover their costs. Right? If that happens, typically any differential would come back to the owner of the vehicle. We'll get there. All right. Judicial lien. So judicial lien comes from a judge's order. So I've lost a court case and I have to pay, and so I would have a judicial lien filed against personal property, real or personal property. So it could be land, it could be my car, it could be things that I own, jewelry, or what have you. All right, and that's from a judge's decree. Writ of attachment is designed to prevent the sale off of assets, things of value, while I'm being sued in anticipation of an adverse judgment. Right? And this is typically done at the motion of the plaintiff. So if I'm being sued for non-payment, the plaintiff may make a motion to attach, say, a bank account to the trial, essentially. And what that means is I wouldn't have access to that bank account. Technically, the sheriff would take possession of that bank account. I wouldn't have access to those funds. And then if I don't end up losing the case, if I actually end up winning the case, then it just goes away, and I would have access to my funds again. So it's really put in place to protect plaintiffs or debitors, plaintiffs, creditors, from winning the case but not being able to collect anything because the debtor has moved money, liquidated all assets, transferred everything into family and friends' names or things like that. All of those things are illegal, but they can happen. All right. Writ of execution. All right. This is after you've lost the case. So the writ of attachment is during the trial or before the trial. The writ of execution means you've lost and you now have to pay. And this is the writ that authorizes the sheriff to take personal possessions, liquidate them if need be, and transfer them to satisfy the judgment. Okay, so moving on from liens into garnishment. And garnishment really is just a seizure order for property being held by third parties. So the most common are employers, wages earned as you work, and also fiduciaries, bank accounts, brokerage accounts, those types of fiduciary relationships. All right, and so a writ of garnishment basically is a court order to send, if it's wages, to send them to a creditor. All right, so that's garnishment. I will say, and it's important to know, that only a certain percentage of wages can be garnished. The idea is that people still have to live. And alternatively, if my entire check was garnished, it may eviscerate my motivation to actually show up and continue to work, which allows me to pay off that claim. All right. Composition agreements. All right. Debtor and creditor just agree that, okay, I'm going to pay less. Debtor's going to pay less. Creditor's going to accept less. And this will discharge the original contractual agreement. That's a composition agreement, and they're enforceable. All right, so they can discharge the underlying agreement. In other words, creditors can't say, I'll take less. The debtor pays less, and then the creditor sues for the original amount less whatever was paid. You can't do that. So if a creditor enters into a composition agreement, they have to do so in good faith, and they have to live by the terms of their own agreement. All right. Mortgages. So mortgages are typically long-term loans on real property. All right. The mortgage itself is actually a document that gives creditors security rights in real property, so land and buildings and all things attached to it. Okay, so I referenced this chapter being a CPA exam chapter. So these terms most people confuse or switch. So if you see these on the CPA exam, you won't make that mistake. All right. So a mortgagor is the debtor, and from a legal perspective, they give the mortgage to the creditor, to the lender. All right. And the mortgagee is the creditor, right? They're the party who has given value, typically for purchase, but it could be for, home equity credit or something along those lines. But the mortgagee is, so if I own property and I have a loan from Bank of America, I am the mortgagor, and Bank of America is the mortgagee. All right. And so mortgages typically always incur interest, except for Habitat for Humanity. If you are familiar with them, they do issue zero interest loans, but that's a not-profit organization. The vast majority of mortgages do incur interest. And fixed rate, which means it's the same rate for the entirety of the loan. So if you have a 30-year mortgage, the fixed rate of 3%, it means you're going to pay 3% on the outstanding balance every year. All right, for the next 30 years. And adjustable rates usually are fixed, but in a relatively short term. So either 1 year, 3 year, 5 year period, and then they'll readjust either up or down based on some metric. Usually it's a LIBOR or a federal rate plus a certain percentage. Foreclosure. So typically foreclosure is a bad day for both the mortgagor and the mortgagee, right? Because it's a long and expensive process. All right, it takes a lot of time and there's a lot of cost involved. All right, the right of foreclosure exists when the debtor has defaulted, and from a technical point, that could be 1 day late on any payment. All right. From a practical standpoint, you can miss a lot of payments before the bank starts to foreclose, just because it's a process where they spend a lot of money. The banks do, the mortgagees do, and oftentimes they still lose a substantial amount of money even after foreclosure. All right. But the idea is that at the end of the foreclosure process, the bank is now the owner. The bank or the lender is now the owner of the real property, the land, the house, whatever was mortgaged. And they have the legal right to sell the property to recover their investment. All right. And that's foreclosure. All right. Let's talk about some alternatives to foreclosure, because foreclosure really makes a loser out of everybody. Sometimes, I mean, it happens, but there are alternatives, and oftentimes mortgagees are willing and interested in working through some other alternative. Right? Plus, it is bad PR. Kind of the big bank with all the money, is kicking someone out of their home. Anyway. Forbearance. And there's a lot of this happening in this moment with COVID. All right. This is generally the lender just stops the collection of mortgage payments for a period of time. All right. With the hopes that the borrower can start back making mortgage payments in the future. All right. Workout agreement. This sounds similar to a refinancing, but it looks a little different, right? So with the workout agreement, typically what's happening is the borrower, the homeowner, the landowner, is having difficulty making payments timely, and so they really change the terms of the loan agreement, which can include extending the time to get a lower payment, or restructuring various things, but most commonly it's an extension of time to get a lower payment that's more manageable to the debtor. All right. Short sale. This can be for a couple of reasons. It could be because the buyer is suffered a hardship, um, but it could be based on market conditions as well. It could just be that um, the market for real estate has changed, and now I owe $200,000 on a loan that um, on property that's now worth $140,000. All right. Um, anyway, there's a hardship that's been suffered, and so I call the bank and say I'd like to arrange for a short sale. And basically, what that means is I'm going to sell the house. The bank will get to sign off on the sale. All right. Um, the sale's not going to raise an amount equal to the loan amount. It's going to raise less than that, but the bank is going to accept whatever proceeds that we get as full payment, basically. All right, that's a short sale.